Let's start some heart anatomy, starting with the structures that are superficial to the heart, the pericardium. Now, this is a serous membrane. Now, you might remember every body cavity is lined with a serous membrane, which secretes a small amount of serous fluid. That serous fluid functions to reduce friction when there's rub between two organs and within that body cavity. So this is the pericardium. We're talking about the pericardial cavity within the mediastinum. So the cavity for the heart has its own serous membrane. And of course, every serous membrane has a visceral layer and a parietal layer. Visceral layer is always adhered to the surface of the organ. Parietal layer is always adhered towards the body wall. So of course, we're going to start with the parietal pericardium, which actually has two components. Your heart has a specialized fibrous pericardium, which is not a serous membrane. So this is a pretty tough outer covering of the pericardium. Before you can actually get to the heart anatomy, if you're dissecting into somebody's mediastinum, you're going to have to cut that pericardium with a pair of scissors. It's not easily ripped, torn, or ruined in any other way. So fibrous pericardium comes first, followed by and attached to this serous pericardium. So this is where that serous membrane that actually secretes that small amount of fluid starts. There's the parietal serous pericardium associated with the fibrous pericardium. And remember that this is always a continuous structure. It does a little U-turn. Maybe you remember that like fist inside of a balloon picture that we always have to look at. So it does a little U-turn, and when it's adhered to the surface of the heart, we call that the visceral pericardium, which actually is the same thing as the epicardium. So you have this simple squamous tissue on the surface of the heart that is known as the epicardium. It's actually continuous with the serous pericardium. So that can be a little confusing for people. They are the same thing. Now, of course, there is a small space with a small amount of fluid within this pericardium, which is really important for you. Your heart starts beating before you're physically born. It keeps on beating until the day you die or get an artificial heart, or you put in a heart-lung bypass for some period of time, go into cardiac arrest. Lots of ways, a handful of ways that your heart can stop beating before you die. Most of them lead to you dying. So that's your pericardium. Because your heart is beating that consistently, that is a lot of friction. And you may remember from physics that friction causes heat, and heat can cause damage. And one thing we definitely don't want on the surface of your heart is for these cells to be damaged. Your heart, especially the next layer of your heart in your myocardium, is made out of cardiomyocytes, cardiac muscle cells. Adult muscle cells are non-mitotic, so if these cells die, they do not come back. So every time a cell on the surface or inside of your heart dies, your heart becomes less effective. And that's going to tie into all kinds of things. So, superficial anatomy of the heart. We have a lot of great vessels associated with the heart. These big blood vessels emerging from the heart, this anatomically correct heart, those are known as the great vessels. So the great vessels, the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, these both lead to the right atrium. By the way, we'll have a posterior view. Here's the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. This is the dorsal surface of the right atrium. So it's not exactly that they're continuous, but they're both coming to the same place. We always have to sort of illustrate it cut off like this, and it's hard to get the full view. We want to get a three-dimensional understanding of this heart. So superior vena cava, inferior vena cava to the right atrium. Over here you have the aorta, including the aortic arch. It's just all of your blood vessels are named for their locations at any given point, so you could further break this down into ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta. I'm only explaining that to you in case you're looking at some other pictures of this and you see all of these different labels for it. So it's all the aorta. You can call the whole thing the aorta if you want to, but if you're thinking, what's the difference between the aorta and the aortic arch? There's none. It's the position. It's the location you're marking. Over here is the pulmonary trunk, which gives rise to the pulmonary arteries. Now this is a blue vessel, but it is taking blood away from the heart. That makes it an artery. So you can't trust red and blue, especially in the great vessels, to tell you if it's an artery or vein. You have to understand the anatomy. Pulmonary trunk to pulmonary arteries, we're taking that deoxygenated blood to the capillaries in the lungs. So away from the heart to the lungs, that's why it's deoxygenated right now. It's going to get oxygenated in the lungs, and the lungs are going to send it back to the left side of the heart via the left and right pulmonary veins. Now again, these are cut off in the anterior view. Let's look at the posterior view to see that the left and right pulmonary veins are all associated with the left atrium. So that's why they give you that cut off view right there. These do have to be cut off like this. Now if I'm dissecting a heart, a lot of the lab guides for human cadaver dissection want you to cut off the vena cava as close to the heart as possible, the aorta as close to the heart as possible. That never made any sense to me. If you want to actually understand this, vena cava structure, these are blood vessels here, this structure here, why would you cut it that so close to the heart where you can't see it? These have to be cut this close to the heart because the lungs are right here. These are going straight into the lungs. These are coming straight from the lungs. The lungs are right here. You can't cut these any further out because you're cutting into lung tissue at that point. So these make sense to be cut off, and this is a good view, but if you're dissecting, I wish we would just rewrite all of those to have these cut off the way they're illustrated in textbooks like this. Okay, so great vessels, we got the major ones: pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, pulmonary veins, aortic arch, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. These all have names too, but we're not dealing with those. They're not great vessels. And then dorsal coronary sinus. I was like, where did they put the line? They used a bracket. This whole thing right here is the coronary sinus. And that is significant as well. Do we have that? Okay. Now, we have some superficial structures that tell us what is happening deep into this heart. So we'll get into the internal anatomy in a minute. The basics that you need to know right now is that there are 4 chambers of the heart. 2 atria, which are generally superior structures. Everything's tilted, so atria, ventricles. This is the superficial landmark for your right atrium. This is superficial landmark for left atrium. Posterior view, right atrium, left atrium. These vessels right here hang out inside of a structure known as the interventricular sulcus. So we can translate that to be the sulcus, which is a divot, an invagination. The sulcus between 2 ventricles. So the ventricles are going to be on either side of the sulcus where all of these blood vessels are running. You have a left ventricle and a right ventricle. Now, the left ventricle is not smaller than the right ventricle. The heart is anatomically kind of a spiral. And so more of this left ventricle is visible from the posterior view. See how that works? So you have the anterior interventricular sulcus with an anterior interventricular artery. That thing in red right there is, in fact, the artery in this case. And that travels along with the great cardiac vein. These are branches of the left coronary artery, which is not labeled on here, and that's okay. What you do have labeled is the right coronary artery, which itself branches. It's going to, watch it here, and then posterior view will pick it up right over here, right coronary artery. and that's going to give you your posterior interventricular artery and the posterior interventricular sulcus. So again, we have another sulcus on the dorsal surface of the heart, separating the right ventricle from the left ventricle. So we have these superficial landmarks that tells you what chamber is deep to that structure. That coronary sinus is also in a coronary sulcus. So you have a sinus and a sulcus. And that coronary sulcus divides the atria from the ventricles. Let's see, what else can I show you superficially here? I think we may have gotten all of these. Not on the list, but in case anybody's ever worked a telefloor before or heard an alternate term for some of these things, anterior interventricular artery, if you're a cardiothoracic surgeon and you're spending your life on it and you do not want to say anterior interventricular artery 72 times a day, you're probably going to call it LAD, left anterior descending. And likewise, instead of calling it posterior interventricular artery, you probably call it right posterior descending, because it's a little bit easier. They also have nicknames because it's very common to have blockages in these arteries, occlusions. We'll look at atherosclerotic plaque development later, and this is a really, really common site for that, this anterior interventricular artery. It's called the widowmaker. So once it's got a nickname, you know it's a big deal, right? Okay, so there's a good reason for you to be learning this, is why I'm telling you. Here is our cadaver anatomy. Obviously, it's not color-coded in a cadaver, but you can still recognize these structures. This one has been cleared of fat. There's a typical quantity of pericardial fat that's a little bit protective. It's possible to have too much pericardial fat. This one has had all of that fat cleared off so that you can really recognize that LAD, that anterior interventricular artery, is within the anterior interventricular sulcus, that there is in fact a sulcus there. Really see that right coronary artery there, and because again you've got that sulcus, you do have a nice dividing line to tell you that there's a right ventricle under here and there's a left ventricle under here. This is kind of a weird looking heart. We've got some flappy bits in the atria that we're just not addressing right now, so that's fine. Let's do some deep heart anatomy. There's a lot more anatomy on the inside than there is on the outside. A lot of it overlaps though. You still have your great vessels, superior and inferior vena cava. Now you can see the openings for the superior and inferior vena cava. One reason I told you about that coronary sinus on that dorsal view, let's look at that again. Look at this coronary sinus. Now, all of the veins in coronary circulation, so the heart has its own circulation. That's what the coronary arteries are for. And the coronary veins are going to take that deoxygenated and waste-filled blood back to the coronary sinus, and that's actually going to drain to the right atrium as well. So basically all of that deoxygenated blood from your body, from your head, from your arms, from your abdomen, from your legs, but also from your heart, it's all coming back to the right atrium. So you've got openings for your superior and inferior vena cava, and you've also got an opening for the coronary sinus. So that's why you've got this extra little hole in there. Not extra, necessary hole in the right atrium. So right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. The ventricles are separated by an interventricular septum. So remember, you've got interventricular sulci. Superficially, those are going to be superficial to the interventricular septum that separates the two ventricles from each other. There is an intraatrial septum. It's harder to visualize in these 2D illustrations. But you can tell that these are separate entities, right? Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. One thing that's important to note from this image is look at the thickness of the wall of the right ventricle and compare that to the thickness of the wall of the left ventricle. Now this chamber when the ventricles contract, and they contract simultaneously, when both ventricles contract, this right ventricle is going to send blood through the pulmonary trunk, through the pulmonary arteries, to the lungs. So the whole distance that they're trying to pump blood is right here and here. Lungs are right there. It's right in the middle. When the ventricles contract, the left ventricle is actually connected. It's behind this pulmonary trunk here, but this left ventricle is connected to the aorta. So this is sending blood to the entire body. So this is in charge of sending red blood cells to the tips of your toes. That means that this muscular wall in the left ventricle should be thicker than this wall right here on the right side of the heart. So that's the typical arrangement. That's the healthy arrangement. Let's see, what else do I want to say while I'm here? Let's look at the valves. There are a lot of cooks in this kitchen. There's a lot of different names for these things. So we're going with tricuspid and bicuspid. That means this one has 3 cusps. This one has 2 cusps. And there are certain medical illustrations or dissected hearts that you can actually look at that have the correct number of cusps in them, and you can prove that to yourself. So the tricuspid is associated with the right side of the heart. The bicuspid is associated with the left side of your heart. Remember that blood that's deoxygenated comes here first, gets sent to the lungs, comes back to the left side of your heart. So you could argue this before this. If it doesn't really make sense, it's a circuit. But we always start from a certain place in that circuit. So this one comes first, this one comes second, the way we always describe it. So the mnemonic device for this is try before you buy. Try before you buy. But like I said, there's different cooks in this kitchen. They are also known as atrioventricular valves. They separate the atria from the ventricles. This one separates this atrium from this ventricle. So this is the right AV valve, this is the left AV valve, otherwise known as the right atrioventricular valve and the left atrioventricular valve. And there's a third name for just the bicuspid over here. It's also known as the mitral valve. Clinically, it is important for you to be able to recognize bicuspid, left AV, mitral valve are all the same thing. You do have concepts like mitral valve stenosis or mitral regurgitation. A lot of our pathology terms connect to that word mitral. So yes, you need to know all of them. What else? Left atrium, we have the openings for the pulmonary veins. And then notice with these AV valves, we have a certain way that they're anchored in the ventricles. We have little tendons. They're the heartstrings, so to speak. You don't get to write heartstrings. You do have to write chordae tendineae if I ask you about that. And then there's a muscular component. So we have these little extensions of the cardiomyocytes, the cardiac muscle cells. Those are called papillary muscles. So those actually just help anchor the bicuspid and tricuspid valves. They're really preventing prolapse. So as you can imagine, if they're contracting, that would actually cause them to open. So their contraction actually just prevents prolapse, which prolapse would look like this. Let's come back to this concept of the one-way valves going through the heart. That one takes a minute too, doesn't it? In addition to the tricuspid and bicuspid, you have 2 more valves. You have the pulmonary semilunar valve, which some people will call the pulmonic valve, and the aortic semilunar valve. Some people will call it the aortic valve. I like the whole thing. At least for now, while you're starting out, you have to prove that you know what you're talking about. You know, when you're an advanced cardiothoracic surgeon, you can call it the aortic valve, but until then, you're going to call it the aortic semilunar valve. All of these are one-way valves. The atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid, are oriented this way. The semilunar valves are oriented this way. and they're shaped like half moons, which again you can see anatomically on certain images if you seek them out. So when the atria contract, that's actually going to help, well, usually these are passively open. When the atria are contracting, the AV valves are open like this. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves shut. So the more fluid you push in this direction against an AV valve, the harder it's shut. At least in a working system. There's ways that this does not work, and that's patho. With the semilunar valve, when the ventricles contract, these squeeze the heart from the bottom like a tube of toothpaste. And so they're oriented in this direction, which means once you squeeze that tube of toothpaste, they're going to be opened up. But when the ventricles contract, when that starts to relax, and any blood tries to go back into those ventricles, it's going to get caught on those cusps, and it's going to close again. So the direction of the valve determines that the blood can only go through one direction. So when it's faced this way, the blood can only go this way. When it's facing this way, the blood can only go this way. And so the four chambers of your heart are all acting together to push blood forward through this system, through a cycle. So again, that direction is right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries out to the lungs, capillaries, oxygenation. Pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, out through the aorta. We can do that with a little bit more detail, and I will, because I do need to push you a little bit here. Deoxygenated blood comes in through the right atrium. We go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. We go through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, to the lungs, oxygenation. Oxygenated blood returns through the left and right pulmonary veins to the left atrium, through the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta, and then to the rest of the body. There you go. Now that is considering the heart as two side-by-side pumps. They're not pumping like this, though. They're pumping like this. So when the atria contract, they both contract in unison. And when the ventricles contract, they both contract in unison. So it's really right and left atria contract and push any remaining blood into the ventricles. Ventricles contract and push any remaining blood into the lungs or the body, respectively. So it's all happening simultaneously. And I'm going to stop there so that we can do this next bit separately, because 23 minutes is enough.